Evening, everyone. My name is Michael O'Kane, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to our HAI talk this evening. And before introducing you to our wonderful speaker, Mr. John Lonergan, some small comment on the format. As you can see, we have clicked recording. If you're uncomfortable with being in a recorded room and talk, um, you may want to leave, but typically everybody loves to stay, which is a great sign for our talks. Um, as your host, just some small additional housekeeping rules. As mentioned at the beginning, we ask you to kindly stay on mute or audio off on your laptop or computer until after John's chat. We will endeavour to take questions at the end when we've had our conversation and wonderful chats. If there are any comments in the comment boxes, we'll endeavour to, as always, get to them and put them to John as we best we can. I'm joined ably by my colleague Neve, who will support the technical parts to the event this evening. And now a few small words on what is humanism. Humanism is a simple philosophy. It is an ethical life stance which focuses on human values, being good without God. It is about taking responsibility and treating others with respect while living our one life. And if you would like to know more about um, humanism, you can look at that and the statement of the fundamental principles of modern humanism, otherwise known as the Amsterdam Declaration, is available online. And you may also find that on our wonderful website here in Ireland, www.humanism.ie. Now to our speaker, Mr. John Lonergan, who is here. So that's a good sign, a good start. Good evening, John. Um,
Hi.
Hi and welcome. So just to kind of give people a sense of what lies ahead, John will talk about his journey as a former governor of Mountjoy Prison, and we'll be looking at compassion and service as key elements to that. Um, John is a native of Banshee, County Tipperary. He served in the Irish Prison Service for over 42 years. He was governor of Mountjoy Prison for a significant amount of that, 22 years, and governor of the top security prison at Port for almost 4 years. He retired in 2010, and later that year's autobiography, The Governor, was published. In 2013, he wrote a book on parenting with the title Parenting Raise Your Child in Ireland Today, and with the royalties of that kindly going to Barnardo's, the children's charity. And nowadays, John delivers talks on a wide range of subjects to communities, voluntary groups, workers, and students. He is an active supporter of many charitable organizations. His philosophy is that change, personal or otherwise, cannot be enforced on people, believing that real and meaningful change only comes about through dialogue, consent, and agreement. He is convinced that human beings change from the inside out and suggests that the big challenge for all of us is to find the humanity in others and then to nurture it. The more we are in touch with our own humanity, the more likely we are to treat others with humanity, show respect to gain respect. So, certainly key touch points there that we all look at within Humanism Ireland. And without further ado, again, good evening, John.
Hi, Michael. Yeah,
How are you?
I'm very well, and it's a pleasure to do this. So I'm looking forward to the chat now.
Fantastic. And you were saying you are in Dublin residing, but maybe before we get into your work in the prison system, could you tell us a little bit about the young John Lonergan growing up in Banshee in Tipperary? Set the
Yeah,
scene.
yeah. I grew up in the parish of Banch and Kilmyler, which is in West Tipperary. Banch is about 4 miles east of Tipperary town, and it's a gateway into the Galtee Mountains and the Galtee Moor and all that sort of scenic area. Um, when I was growing up, I there was a very famous local parish priest, very active on social affairs in the parish of Bancha. Some people would have heard of him, the late Canon Hayes, who was, of course, the founder of Muintir na way back in 1937. And he was the local parish priest when I was born. And I suppose our claim to fame, Michael, which people wouldn't realise today, but in 1947, rural electrification commenced in Ireland, and Bancha and Kilmila were selected as the first rural parish to receive electricity and to install it. And that, of course, was very revolutionary. And electricity, we forget now, but sure, everything changed with electricity. So it was growing up in it, and he had a big interest in the local community. He founded Mountjoy na Tíre as a national organisation to build rural Ireland, particularly from the ground up, as he called it. And his philosophy was very much caring and sharing, caring about others and sharing with others. And in particular, sharing your time and your abilities and your skills to help other people less fortunate than you. For instance, if you were healthy and your neighbour was in poor health, he believed that you should help that person in poor health. If you were educated, which everyone wasn't in those days, that you should help people who were unlucky not to be educated or unfortunately not, and so on. So I grew up in that environment, which was a very, I suppose, a very influential environment, and very much about others and about caring for people and all that. And then, when I was only 20, I joined the prison service by accident, not by design. And I ended up being assigned to Limerick Prison on the 8th of March 1968. And
Perhaps, John, sorry if I may, you might explain that how, because that was what I was kind of going to get to, is how did John Lonergan enter the prison service, if you will. So maybe you might elaborate on how it happened by accident. I'd love to hear that.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was on the basis that, and some people would have maybe set out to have a career, or set out to, as an objective to have a career. I most certainly didn't do that. And it happened by accident, in the sense that vacancies in the prison service were advertised in the local or in the daily newspapers, and I responded to the advertisement, and I eventually was interviewed and whatever else, and in March 68, I was assigned to Limerick. I knew nobody that ever worked in the prison, or I never knew anybody that was ever in prison, believe it or not. So I had no idea really.
And
And
was there anything particular that, that drew like your eye to the advertisement? Because, to say like you're at 20 years of age, was there any other little pathway you were contemplating before entering the prison service?
Yeah, I suppose there was a lot of different. I suppose when I was younger, I had this an ambition to be a carpenter, and that didn't transpire. And then maybe I certainly had this fascination about trucks as well. But at the end of the day, as I said, almost on impulse, I responded to this advertisement, and then everything followed after that. And I ended up, and I have often said that to young people in secondary school, especially to encourage them to follow, for where the opportunities are, and not to be too concerned about whether they planned it or not, because sometimes you follow that and it brings you on a path and a journey that you never envisaged, but can be very, very rewarding and can be very fulfilling. And that's what happened in my case. I found it, I suppose, challenging, and I found it rewarding, and I grew into it, and it educated me, and I learned most of what I know in life from my work in the prison, and those who worked in it, and those who lived in it and were sentenced to imprisonment, and all the stuff that happens around that whole environment, where again,
And
where I suppose poverty, and equality and inclusion were very much part and parcel of the lives of the people who ended up in prison. They were excluded, they were poorly educated, they certainly were, the vast majority came from social disadvantaged areas and from poverty, and many of them had physical disability, mental health issues, alcoholic issues. And what I learned early on in life, in the prison system, was that life wasn't black and white, and it wasn't as easy or as simple or as obvious as we often expected from the outside. So it was a very complex process that brought people to prison. And I suppose from there on, I began to realize that there was certain I suppose, things I could do to make life better for people,
mm,
and trying to encourage them to move away from criminality, and to live, I suppose, life in a more normal way. Because from a very early part of my experience, I realized that prison was horrible, and it was also a horrendous waste of time for the vast numbers of people who ended up in prison, because they were young people that had very little life experience, had very little opportunities in life, but were wasting whatever opportunities were there for them in the outside. They were wasting them while they were in prison.
mm. Maybe if you wouldn't mind, sort of like when you entered in 1968, I think I saw, another interview you did online around the staff that you were with. So being 20 years of age, you said you learned a lot from the what you termed as quite old fellows or chaps that were only 40, by the way, which hopefully we're all looking a bit younger, feeling younger. But you said that the men that were in the system at the time, they taught you a lot. I mean, things like one person would never smoke, but he'd have a packet of cigarettes on him, where it might be useful. So maybe you might teach us about the people that you worked with that allowed you to learn some of the skills that you have obviously um you know furthered on. Like, so from those early days, what was it like, the people you met and worked with?
Yeah, it varied, of course. Like in any other job, it varied, and some people, were pretty rigid, and I suppose some of them came from an army background and were very, I suppose, I suppose, focused on a military type discipline and regime, and then others weren't. And I met some amazing people actually in prison over the years. That it's and where the man Pat Luram was his name. He was from County Westmeath originally, and he was. Again, even today, people in their 20s, they look at someone that's in their mid 40s, maybe, or late 40s, and they think they're old. And I thought that at that time I'd be insulted now, of course, and I'm in my 70s if someone said I was
Yeah,
old. But that's
exactly.
what life does. It gives you a great insight into things, and it puts everything into perspective. But he was one example of, and he wasn't the only one, but he stood out a mile in the sense that he was very kind, a very
Mhm.
sensitive man. And the cigarette one was true, because he never smoked, but he always had cigarettes. And cigarettes were rationed. It's hard to believe that now, but in 1968 in Limerick prison and in all prisons, cigarettes were rationed, and prisoners were only allowed 4 cigarettes a day, if they had them, and they only could have them if their families left them into cigarettes, because there was no shops in the prisons in those days. So you can imagine, a heavy smoker, and most of them did smoke, because that's
Mm,
part and parcel, of I suppose, two institutions very much synonymous with cigarette smoking. There were mental hospitals and prisons, and so they
mm,
nearly all smoked. But I never smoked myself, but I'm told that cigarettes, if you're very aggressive, or in a depression, or if you're very aggressive and full of anxiety, that a cigarette has the capacity to relax.
mm,
And he used the cigarettes often to defuse the situation by
mm,
saying to a guy, like, sit down, and then give him a cigarette. They smoked that and relaxed. And of course, by the time he had smoked, the whole scene had evaporated, and he was back to normal again, and he was relaxed. He was also very kind to us as staff, and he did little favors for us, like leaving us off to play sport and things like that, especially on a Sunday, when you weren't entitled to be off, but he'd give you a couple of hours off. So he was very popular with us, and with the prisoners, and very unpopular with the authorities. So it was funny.
mm.
The
Yeah, that's what
authorities
I
thought
that's what I picked up on. That he
yeah.
was unpopular with the authorities because he had a different approach, he had a different philosophy.
And many people outside of the prison, even to this day, would identify with the same thing. They assumed and identified him and associated with being too soft, whatever that means. But
Mm,
he still would get more out of people than the hardliners, and people would respond to him when they would do the very opposite to the hardliner. So that was a learning thing, that kindness, is everybody's language, and kindness breaks down all sorts of barriers, and people
mm,
will always remember kindness. And
mm,
he epitomized that, and he promoted that, and I certainly learned from him that was. a different way of connecting with people and influencing people, and hopefully sowing the seeds of change in those people as well.
So when you talk about that, the structures, you know, the governance piece was anti someone like that gentleman you mentioned. How did you you know, overcome the rigidness of the prison system and adapt philosophies like you just talked about to try to find that balance between naturally some type of discipline, but then bringing in the compassion or the kindness that you've sought to kind of carry on with through your work within the prison system?
Yeah, I guess I mean, initially I certainly I hadn't got that, and I was very much aligned to the old system of discipline, and I often reflected on it afterwards, with almost disgust now. That but again, because you're young and with no life experience, because you are young at 20 and you don't have any life experience, and life experience is the greatest educator of all. And there's nothing you can study forever, and you'll never ever be able to accumulate the benefit that you accumulate from life and the experience of life. And if you don't have a life experience, it's very difficult to have the balance right. And so we'll say discipline and all the things that go from that, like all the prisoners were paraded every morning at shortly after 7 a.m. in the morning, and on a straight line. Now the straight line was very important at that time, and subsequently I was saying that it was all a load of rubbish, and it was all a demonstration of power. But one of the things in hindsight afterwards, I often and I did write about it, that because cigarettes were rationed in the morning, if the night duty man was a person, and for all men that time, if he was a smoker, he'd have left butts on the landings, or on the around the floors of the prison during the night. He'd stub them out, and then when they were unlocked in the morning, they'd run, scurry around, collect up the little butts, and break them into smaller little, as they call them, little skinnies, and put them into cigarette papers and make cigarettes out of them. And but when they're on parade, some of them would have a cigarette or a butt of a cigarette, but when they were on parade, they had to put out the cigarette, but some of them put them into their pocket and try to hide it until the parade would be over. But again, I would be looking out, and staff were alert to this. And if they saw smoke coming out of a fellow's pocket, they'd shout at him to put out the cigarette. So he'd have to take out the cigarette, put it on the floor, and stamp on it. And that was his cigarette gone for the day. And so things like that would, as you get older, would say, gosh, even if you said to him, put out the cigarette and let him keep it, there'd be more humanity in it. But anyway, these are the sort of things, the discipline. So I suppose you learn then to be able to to negotiate and to balance between it. The same with food, Michael. When there's food was rationed as well, so they were given 4 slices of bread. And as you got again a bit older and got a little bit more life experience, if a fella wanted 6 slices of bread, you gave him the 6 slices of bread because that was it. And other little things like that as well. It was small little things that would make a difference to guys, and so you learn this, and then you get the benefits as well. Like, which is part of it, is getting the best out of prisoners, because you had them out on workshops doing work for you, and in the laundries washing the clothes by hand that time, and in the kitchen doing all the preparatory work for cooking. But if you were working with them, then of course they were more likely to work better for you and more cooperative and all that sort of stuff. So you began to realize that there were benefits as well. And you're trying to keep the thing that the authorities didn't, as I said, which they did. If they regarded you as being on the soft side, you certainly wouldn't be popular. But then after 3 years in Limerick, which was a very useful experience, I was transferred to an open centre, which was Shanganagh Castle, which is no longer there. But it was for an open centre out near Bray in County Wicklow, just in Shankill, County Dublin, near Bray, County Wicklow. And this was an open centre, and open centre means that there was no walls and no gates or no lock; they weren't locked in. And it was for 16 to 21-year-old boys. And I was transferred up there, and that was a completely new experience. And because I was working with young fellas, and I began to realize again there that, many young fellas had up to 16, 17, 18 years of age had reached that stage of life, and they had hardly ever went to school. They had very poor opportunities. They had very little insight into life, into responsibility, all that sort of stuff. And open centres were all about that. We're trying to encourage the positive side. And of course, open centres were built on the philosophy of, and we're talking a bit tonight about philosophy, they were operating very much on the philosophy of trust towards closed prisons like Limerick and Mountjoy and Portlaoise at that time were very, and still are today, closed prisons. They operate very much on the philosophy of no trust. And
Mm.
so there's no trust in a closed prison. As I said, it goes on the philosophy of nobody trusts anybody, and there's a
Mm.
massive difference for people who, even in our own private lives. Trust is a huge part of relationships. Trust is a huge part of life, of all the sort of things. We appreciate trust more than anything else, and therefore to live in an environment of no trust is certainly very difficult to grow and mature in that environment. And that's the environment of closed prisons. Towards open prisons have the very opposite, and the idea was that you could obviously build better relationship with young people, and you could treat and encourage them to appreciate being trusted and to respond in a positive way to that.
I mean, I mentioned when we spoke yesterday that I did a project where I went to Barcelona on behalf of Irish schools at the time for the European Youth Parliament, and my topic area, which I debated in the Catalan Parliament, was juvenile prison systems, the faults, the deficiencies or ways to improve that, and that was in 1992. And I guess the big question for you tonight and is how much have you seen the prison system change from the profile of prisoners in the early 70s into the 80s, the society of Ireland in terms of we were in some ways backward, lots of immigration, and then moving on to when you wrote your book in 2010, The Governor, have you seen Ireland improve for young people, or do you still feel that as a country, while we've evolved into this, economic powerhouse, if you look at it from a, how we do in various industries, yet beneath the surface, Ireland still has many issues. So, what's your take on how prisons have evolved, and have things got better or have things got worse for young people, right? In
I,
those
I,
systems.
I would say, Michael, it is like many other assessment that you do on life or on a country or whatever. There's both. We have progressed, in many ways. The prison system has progressed in many ways, and it has, believe it or not, regressed also. So in other ways. So, for instance, the progression would be around medical care. That certainly in 2024 is a million miles more progressive and more comprehensive and more significant than it was in 1968 when I started, when a doctor dropped in for 10 minutes and that was it. And nowadays we have full-time nurses, we have a lot of GP hours, we have backup services, psychiatric services. The only time a psychiatrist visited Limerick prison when I was there in 68 to 71 was when he was certifying somebody to be insane and to remove him from the prison to a mental hospital. But other than that, there was no psychiatric services. Today, we have a very progressive, cadre of psychiatrists and services from that background. We have psychology, we have probation and welfare service, we have education in the prisons to some degree, we have some work in the prisons. And I suppose the other area that really has improved over the years would have been the food side, the diet side, and the food. The quality of the food, the quality of the cooking, the servicing of food, all that sort of thing would have really, really progressed. And then I suppose the other side of it then is things that haven't changed is we still have the vast numbers of people going to prison still come from a very significant areas around urban Ireland in particular, where social deprivation still exists. And even today, and the news, the headline is around a guy who was sentenced to 7.5 years in prison for burning a car during the riots last year in Dublin. But what's not being discussed at all, naturally, is what's what gives
Mm.
cause to that. Where does that come from? That anger, that frustration, that viciousness. that drives people, the disconnection they have with their own communities, like the centre of Dublin, where everyone should have an allegiance to. So we still have this problem that the vast numbers of people who go to prison are still stuck in that rut. They're still stuck in drugs. They're still stuck in gangland feuds and all that. And then the other side that regressed, of course, is single cell occupancy, because when I joined in 1968, single cell occupancy was a compulsory statutory requirement that every prisoner had to have his own cell or her own cell, and only a small number of 2 or 3 triple cells were available for people who had psychiatric difficulties and who may self-harm, and they were put in with 2 sane guys to try to keep them sane. And that was it. But everyone else had their own single room. Today we have well over 50% of prisoners having to share single cells,
Mm.
and so and that's why, you know, I was making this point on several occasions in the recent past, that people outside of those who have been in prison and understand about single cell occupancy and the significance and the value of it, they don't appreciate how, you know, the negative consequences that come from overcrowding and from doubling up, because it facilitates drug abuse, it facilitates violence, it facilitates bullying, and it facilitates sexual abuse. And so that's an area where we have actually regressed over the years. So to summarize, I suppose I'd be saying that we have some very good positive things that have taken place, but and we have overcrowding that we hadn't at all in 1968, where there was no overcrowding at all, and where prisons were, you know, we only had 660 people in prison, by the way, in 1968 in total, and 260 of those were boys between the ages of 16 and 21, which were in St. Patrick's Detention Centre, which was close to Mountjoy Prison. So there was only 400 adults. Today we have well over 5,000 adults in prison, and we have the lowest number of 18-year-olds downwards, 12 to 18-year-olds ever in the history of the state. We have less than 50. So you know, it's fascinating to see what has happened. The high numbers of young people that were there in 1968, they seem to have gone down. They are gone down significantly, and then the other numbers have gone up significantly. And we haven't, like many other things, responded to that extra number of people by providing the basic facilities, which are cells.
Mm. I mean, when your book, The Governor, was praised for its candid insights into, you know, the challenges around the penal system, and then looking at ways of penal reform, and then your book about parenting, raising your child in Ireland today, about practical advice for parents and support. Um, I'm wondering, I'm curious, was there some connection between the two? Obviously, you're looking at the challenges of young people in the penal system, and then parenting. You know, where did the connect come for you to write, you know, 2 books maybe seen as at the extremes from each other, but then there must be some perhaps connect to that. Maybe elaborate on that. Where is the
Yeah,
inspiration for the parenting book?
I think, well, the governor was really all about again, very much about the philosophy that I believed in and that I tried to implement, and it was based on, as you mentioned in the introduction, it was based on, you know, the philosophy of showing respect to gain respect. And particularly in a prison, where you might say that's the last place you should be respecting those who end up in prison, and I would be arguing that's the first place you should start, because they are the people who have offended society, and they're the people who have been taken out of society, and therefore the state has a responsibility of showing them how to live properly. Because if the state doesn't do that, and the way the state does that is through its police force, through the courts, and through the prisons, and that's why. And then the connection with the parenting thing is that I believe that the parenting has a massive influence, and while I would never say that, if you're a very good parent, your child will never get into trouble. I learned very over the years that was a false expectation as well, because I know of people who were parents, and they were great parents, but they still had a child who got into difficulty. But on the other hand, I do believe that there's a lot of basic stuff that parents often forget to do. They don't do it often enough, and as a result of that, children often don't get the opportunity to reach their potential, and they don't benefit to the extent that they should from the influence that parents have. Because I believe, Michael, that the two groups and when I'm giving a parenting talk, I always demonstrated by saying that there's two groups of people that are high up on the pedestal as far as children are concerned. And one of the groups are parents. A child is always, I don't care who they are, that every child absolutely looks up to their parents, and they look for guidance, and they look for all sorts of things from their parents, support and encouragement and kindness and love and all that sort of stuff. And equally up on that pedestal are teachers, especially teachers at primary level. And that's one of the things that I would say that if you said to me, what things are not have should Ireland be the proudest of in terms of their achievements, I would say it is the development of our education system. And while it's not perfect by no means, but my God, from the day when I was going to primary school to what it is today, for the vast numbers of children today going to primary school, it is a happy experience. And if you're living in an experience in a happy environment, you're going to build self-confidence, and if you build self-confidence, it opens doors to so many things. So I would be saying that our educational system has made tremendous strides, but I must go back to the teacher, the influence of the teacher, for good or for bad. And the teacher who is has the opportunity to be a very positive influence in a child's life, and especially around encouraging the child, treating the child with respect, all that sort of stuff. And a harsh word or a put down word or a very critical personal comment from the teacher is never forgotten. And that's the power that they have. And that's why I think the stuff I did in parent. But I also talked about drugs. I talked about bullying, or I wrote about bullying. I wrote about suicide. I wrote about drugs and alcohol and communicate, all the sort of stuff that are at different, chapters that are appropriate at different stages of the child's life. And I did learn a lot in prison around bullying and try to understand it. And the same with suicide, and the same with drug abuse. So it was really, I suppose, sharing a lot of the stuff that I learned in prison and sharing that with parents who wouldn't have had. What I always say, Michael, about parenting is, and I've been one myself now for 46 years next week. And, the thing about parenting is, by the time you're sort of competent at it and feel that you're on top of it, it's too late. They're gone. And whatever damage you have done it. And I think most people are the same. If you were to go back again a second time to parent the second time around, you would do it quite differently than you would have done it the first time.
I guess that like the big piece to the maybe back to the prison part, that you've been so passionate about, is I mean, it speaks to that parenting part, but for children and that become young offenders, and I think it's important that we always try our best to view them as humans, right? But you talked a lot about when the system fails that child, where it's a boy or a girl, and they end up in the prison system, the rehabilitation road and education that can be key components to reducing recidivism for that young boy or girl or young offender. What has that been like? Because naturally, for all of us looking from the outside, you'd always wonder how difficult is it going to be to help a young offender or any offender to rehabilitate and to be able to come back into society where they will get respect as a human and be given a chance to begin again or to find a way. So maybe you might touch on that. That how are you successful in your opinion, as your legacy or your takeaway from your activity, to instill structures around education, rehabilitation that can reduce recidivism?
Yeah, the most complicated and challenging task of all. I mean, going back to Whittaker, 40 years ago now, almost since he reported with 40 years next August, and he identified 4 key objectives for prison. And one was a punishment. That prison was a punishment, and it is. He said it was a deterrent, and for some it is a deterrent. It contains people, and that means it prevents them for a certain number of years from committing crime because they're locked up. And the fourth one, he said, was rehabilitation or resocialization or whatever. And I suppose that is the most difficult one. Just for your listeners and those who are in attendance, just to tell them, like, how to, the prison population the world over is basically about men rather than women. A very small percentage of every prison population in the world are women, about 3% in Ireland, against 97% men, and mainly young men. So it is very important to understand that the vast numbers of people in prison are under 35 years of age, the vast numbers. And in my time, the average age was 27, but two-thirds were under 27. So you're talking about young men. In terms of rehabilitation, I suppose I learned very early, Michael, that you can't force change. And I've said that, but you can encourage people to change, and you can facilitate change. And for me, I suppose, yeah, if you said to me now, give your honest opinion in relation to the prison services capacity, and policy and purpose and commitment to rehabilitation, and I say it is zero, absolutely zero. And overcrowding is an example of that. You can't pack people into three and four into a cell and tell them at the same time that you're respecting them and you're respecting them as people. And that is a very powerful signal. And then in terms of, I suppose I said to I've no doubt in my mind at all that the most powerful and challenging start to helping somebody on the road to rehabilitation, if you want to use that word, is human connection. You must connect with them. And to connect with them, you must occupy them and work with them on the basis that they're involved in something, whether that's in training or education or whatever, the dialogue. But human connection is so important. You can't force people, for instance, into education because if they don't want it, but you have to create the environment where they themselves feel. The same with drug treatment and drug addiction and providing drug treatment for them. You can't force them into drug treatment because it won't work, but you can encourage them and facilitate if the facilities are there. But the reality is that prisons over the years are, they're not equipped, or they were never equipped or so far to actually take seriously and implement policies that are really basically around rehabilitation and resocialization. And another major point, Michael, would be to say that prisons will never be able to do it in isolation on their own. There's a need for them to connect with the outside community in relation to all the services that are outside: housing, jobs, treatment centres, you name it. The problem also is that the vast numbers of people in prison come from socially disadvantaged areas where there's often a very negative culture created by their forefathers and their foremothers, and not by them, but they live and they were born into those areas. And when they leave prison, they go back to those areas with nothing to do. And, if you have young men that have no work skills and no real motivation to work and no, I suppose, opportunities to grow and to develop, they're inevitably going to get reconnect with crime. And it's very important to understand that in many of those social disadvantaged areas, the biggest single industry is the drug industry. And it's no use for me or any other people condemning that. The reality is that is the reality for them. And we have to try to work around that by mainly getting them to, and I have no hesitation in saying that the only long-term solution is education. There's no other long-term meaningful solution to it, to social deprivation and poverty. And it is about education. And then the challenge, of course, is how do you connect them to education? How do you sustain them in education, as particularly up to Leaving Cert standard? And when I was in Mountjoy, Michael, only 6% of the prisoners stayed at school after 16 years of age. Don't mention your Leaving Cert. Only 6% stayed at school after 16. So 94% had left education by 16. 57% were gone by 14. So we have a massive challenge on our hands, and prison can play a part in that, but prison will not resolve it on its own.
Yeah, I mean it's profound. I guess maybe kind of a broad with the election looming. If you were in government or you were about to go into government and you had like proposals to fix things like the prison system, and what would you say is needed from here on to improve not only the prison system but for society for those younger people? What would be your key areas if you had a blank canvas that you could go in and make those changes possible?
Well, I have mentioned it already, Michael. I mean, for me, by far the biggest number one priority would be single cell occupancy, because I believe that in the absence of that, everything else is undermined, and you cannot make any progress while that's not while that's still the situation. My second, I suppose, observation is, and the facts and the statistics will support this. We are putting far too many people to prison in Ireland for too short a period of time. About 75% of all committals are 12 months or less. So about 3,700, less than 4,000 a year, and maybe 2,600, 2,700 are serving sentences of 12 months or less. And nothing positive can come out of that. They're not there long enough. There's nothing can be done for them. It's warehousing. They're just brought in, go through the system for 3 or 4 months, out again. And they're the two areas that I would put more emphasis on. Stop putting people into prison for short periods of time. Have alternatives. Control the upper numbers in prison. Don't allow overcrowding to continue indefinitely. Overcrowding has been in existence in the Irish prison service since 1969. Now they're the facts. And so single cell occupancy would be a priority for me. And then in the social areas, and this comes into other areas of the department of government, and that is tackling those areas that are still producing huge numbers of early school leavers, huge numbers of young people who are into drugs and moving away from what we would consider a constructive contribution to life, and inevitably getting involved in gangland feuds and in the drug culture and ending up in prison. And that must be a priority to try to help. And it's no use condemning, like we have the Minister for Justice calling them scumbags. That in itself is a disgrace to refer to. And the behaviour of people, is can be condemned at any level and as hard as you like, but don't condemn the whole person, because these are human beings, and unless we try to reach out to them and try to engage with them, they're just going to continue causing havoc for us. And you can put them to prison, but they're going to come out again, and while they're in prison, they'll be replaced by more young people. So if you have this social connection and this anger and frustration that's going on, the only way to tackle it is to go in there, listen to what the people are saying, and try to respond to them and to their needs, rather than standing back from it. I learned that myself in prison, that you can have all the great ideas in the world, but until you get a buy-in from the prisoners and a connection with the prisoners and the agreement and consent of the prisoners, you're not going to achieve anything. So, and it's very slow, frustrating work, but it has to be done. And that was one of the things that I think I did some work on that, or had some achievements on that, especially maybe in with the younger people, and then maybe with the women's prison in Mountjoy as well. That's it's very, what I said several times is helping to change people. Human change and social change is very slow, very frustrating, but very rewarding once you achieve it.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I mean, you said Ireland is perceived as a very good Ireland Inc. Right? We talk about pharmaceutical, tech. I could spend all my work around university groups, academic teams, research teams, manufacturing, biotech, spin outs, and where there's full employment, and we're deemed to have the most PhD people coming out of universities working in those types of institutions and facilities, and yet those that get left behind are getting left even maybe further behind because they're not getting the same educational opportunities to go through the system and to get those types of jobs, and then they come into your world. So hopefully
Michael,
your
and Michael,
points.
it wouldn't take a prophet to say that situation is going to be exacerbated over the next 10 years, because in the old days there was lots of unskilled labouring type work available to people in the old docks and many other jobs that were very manual jobs. But we know now, with the predictions that are coming up, not alone are those jobs gone, but a lot of jobs that we're doing today will be replaced with technology as well. And so if a person is going into the work arena now, or certainly in 10 years' time, without pretty high-powered qualifications, and with huge flexibility in relation to what they'll be able to do. And believe me, there will be no place for them. And that's one of the challenges, that if kids are dropping out of school at 12 and 13 and 14, and in significant numbers, relatively speaking, well, then we really have a social problem on our hands, and it's going to get worse and more challenging in the future, because as technology and all the sophistication develops and becomes more normalized, those people are going to find it impossible to be able to get employment. And without that, without employment, education leads to employment, and employment leads to life fulfillment. Even though, I mean, people might say they're bored in their jobs, but they have an income, and they have the value of it in self-esteem and in all the different little things that work gives us in terms of status. So when you're disconnected from mainstream society and you're isolated, I'm afraid drugs and prison and crime, they overlap pretty quickly, and they're almost inevitable for young men that grow up in that culture.
As you said, maybe getting worse than getting better. Um, I'm conscious we have a wonderful audience, and people have been very kind to listen to us chatting. I will endeavour to open up the floor. If anybody would like to ask a question, it's as simple as ever. Just raise your hand, and then we'll also look at the comments. Neve, you might look at that. But I see the first person there. Hello, Steve Rawson. Your hand is up, and the room and the floor is yours. Please say hello.
Hi, John. I've always found you to be a very good communicator. I've always listened to you on the radio, and you've always taken a very human approach towards incarceration and prison. You talk a lot about percentages, and I found your percentage very interesting with regard to the age levels in prison. But I would ask you this with regard to, if you were to put a category of, say, drug related or drug issues and, say, mental health issues into one category, what percentage would you consider that to be in our prison system in Ireland in the present day?
Gosh, huge, huge. We don't have a huge amount of research, by the way, which in itself is a scandal. There has been no decent piece of research done in relation to these aspects of things since 1996, when the late Dr. Paul O'Mahony did a major piece of research just in Mountjoy. But that research showed that 1 in every 4 had a history of being an inpatient in a psychiatric hospital, and 40% of all prisoners had connections with psychiatric services. At that time in 1996, 68% had a history of heroin addiction at some stage in their lives, and many of them were active users, and up to 95% smoke cannabis. So the figures are frightening, and I would say myself, from my experience, from my observations in the last 10 or 12 years, I would say that has, well, I'm not sure about the psychiatric element of it, because certainly psychiatric services in prisons are massively improved than they were. But that doesn't mean that people going into prison and committing crime don't have a psychiatric illness background. They have. The drug culture, I mean, the drugs have taken over in terms of the cause of crime. They're probably the cause of at least 80%, maybe 85% of all crimes are either directly or indirectly related to drugs. And that in itself is a frightening statistic. Directly related to drugs would be those who are commissioned for importing drugs, growing drugs, selling drugs, transporting drugs, or storing drugs. And about 22% in my time fell into that category. And then 66% would be in prison indirectly related to drugs. And they would be people who would be addicted to drugs and robbing shops and snatching handbags and breaking into houses and all that type of stuff, along with then the gangland feuds that are all directly related to drugs as well. All in that category that are directly or indirectly related to drugs. So you're talking about 80 to 85% of all people in prison would have a connection with drugs. Many of them are drug addicted as well, and that's another scourge in the terms of, you know yourself that when a person has a serious addiction problem, they're not going anywhere in terms of rehabilitation or crime-free lives or anything, because if they're addicted, they're caught up in that whole culture of drugs. So it's a massive challenge, and it hasn't got better. And I would my view would be, and my from my observation would be, it has actually got worse.
Thank you, John. Steve, is that okay for you?
Yeah, I suppose like just the point, I probably should have said drug dependency as opposed to related to drugs. So there's a difference between, as you rightly pointed out, those with a drug dependency and those who are imprisoned for running drug operations and importing drugs and making profit from drugs.
Yeah.
So I'm talking
as
about,
you know, the vast numbers of those are not drug users at all. They never use drugs themselves at all, and they're not caught up at all in that side of it. And now there'll be small number, or there'll be a significant number of people in prison as small-time suppliers of drugs, but they'd be the minnows working for the higher power people. But most of the higher power people that they're the odd one convicted and sentenced to very long periods of prison, but they don't. And now, in my experience, they didn't use drugs at all, and so they had no drug dependency problems at all. But the huge number, I would estimate around 60, the research showed 66%, but around 66%, 65% would have that problem that you're talking about, an addiction to drugs and a dependency on drugs. And of course, that is a massive challenge.
Massive.
Now, I should say as well that over the last 20 years, the response to drug dependency has the treatment and the support, like in the prisons, has certainly improved dramatically over the last 20 years or so in relation to responding to that dependency, like in the provision of treatment and opportunities to become drug free, and drug counsellors being seconded into the prisons from Merchants Quay in Dublin, and the nurses and many of them have expertise in addiction as well. Doctors have experience, some of them employed are experienced in addiction. So there's a massive improvement in terms of the services that are there. But as you know, a lot of people who have a dependency on drugs are not interested in treatment. So and another challenge is to try to motivate them to take an interest in treatment and to commit themselves to treatment and to abstinence, and that's not easy in a prison environment. And by the way, I should also tell your audience or those listening that the culture in prison has a massive negative influence as well, because contrary to what many people might think and expect, the drug culture itself, the prisoners' culture that they create, would be very much opposed to drug treatment. They don't want people in prison to go for treatment because they don't want to see people progressing away out of drugs. And the same with education. Those who need education, and the vast numbers in prison do need to be educated to, in terms of basic education. But the prison culture wouldn't be very encouraging. Indeed, it would be the opposite. It would be discouraging fellas to go to education. So it's a very sort of a complex culture as well, that it takes a lot of understanding. And unless you understand it, it's very difficult to tackle it. So you need all sorts of different approaches to try to connect with the prisoners, to try to get them out of what they consider their environment and their culture, and to move away through drug treatment or through education or through work training, counselling, all that sort of stuff.
Thank you, John. Dan, Jay O'Sullivan, and Chris, I'll come to Dan first. Dan, if you would kindly, please go ahead. Hello, Dan. Can you hear us, Dan? Can you able to say ask your question? We might come back to you, Dan. Chris, I see you there. Chris, would you like to say hi, please?
Yeah, thanks so much for the talk, John. I've been really struck, I guess, by what you said about the social deprivation. I live in Posho, South Dublin, and work in Ballymun, or did. But I'd say one of the challenges is getting a lot of my neighbours on board with the idea of addressing the social deprivation. And they probably agree with the kind of scumbag comments. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on how we kind of address that with them and change the conversation to take that more humanitarian view.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a battle. It's a battle I would have, undertaken for many, many years. And as you know, probably personally know, it's not an easy argument, or it's not an easy task to undertake, to try to convince people who have no idea. I don't blame them in that sense, because they're so distant from it. They have no insight into how young people, for instance, are created and immersed in that sort of environment that where there's no respect. They don't show respect to anyone, but then they can claim they're not respected either. And so it comes from a very young age, in a and when you, my the benefits I had from the job, and as a result of the job, being able to go into many of these areas, was to experience those areas myself, and to see and to feel what's wrong there in terms of negativity and all that stuff. And I remember early on going to what is known as a very disadvantaged area in Darndale, on the north side of Dublin, to a young person's a prize giving evening one evening. And the local sister, who was very active in the community, had about 25 or 38 and 9-year-olds in a choir, and they were beautiful and sang lovely. And I was chatting to her afterwards, and she said, well, the sad thing is, by the age of 11 or 12, every single one of them will have dropped out and gone, because the culture will drag them away. And she just felt like, we do our best while we have them, and then they go, and that's it. And I suppose it's to try to understand that, where going to school in South Dublin, for instance, and in other 95% of areas, is normal for nowadays, 23, 24-year-olds, whether it is first level, second level, or third level. But going to school and educating yourself and all that is part of normality. This is what we do. And the benefits we get then, our jobs and status and all that, they don't have that, where everyone belonged to them, probably within prison, or within, certainly in the courts, where they're male, particularly male influencers, are very negative male, role models. Very few of them have positive role models in their lives. And it is a very, very frustrating, difficult task to try to, and as you know from your own experience, it is about going out, making contact with them, talking with them, I call it connecting with them, and then hopefully encouraging them in whatever way. And I'm a great believer myself that, I use the I suppose the arts in a general way, whether that was art of painting, or music, or drama, or one of those particular disciplines, to start the process of getting them involved in something they can enjoy, something that's not very demanding, but beginning to build up maybe self-confidence, and making them aware that there's another way of getting excitement in life. There's another way of getting in fulfillment, and there's another an option. But it's slow, and you're not going to get it overnight. And I suppose that's the difficulty that you have with the mainstream of society, is that they think the solution is, for them, it's obvious. And they think to implement it is easy, but you will know from your experience, it's far from easy. And you have to have the patience of Job, and you have to have an absolute commitment to stay for the long journey, because it is a long journey. So it is very, very difficult. But I have, myself, use sport, drama, the arts, music, all those sort of things as ways and means of bringing them in almost from the cold, and getting them involved in something where there's a bit of discipline, where there's a bit of commitment needed, and where there's an enjoyment at the end of it. Because, if you play music or whatever, if you're on the stage, like drama was very successful in Mountjoy, and turned around numerous numbers of people's lives. But it took me, a lot of people wouldn't see that as a very obvious way, but it is these are the ways sometimes of how you connect with people. And then once you have that connection made, then you can build on that, and you have a far better chance of encouragement and leading them and helping them in that, because they listen to you. And the title in Mountjoy, for anyone working in Mountjoy, was they gave a period of months assessing you. But if you got the title from that you're sound, well, then you were really, going to make progress then, because they respected you and they responded to you, and you had the opportunity to inspire them. But it took a while before you got the title sound. And it wasn't do-gooders, or it wasn't softies, or it was a person who had qualities, who had his word. He was an honourable person. When he said yes, he meant yes. When he said no, he meant no. He was kind, but not a softie. And he had values himself or herself. they had values, and they lived by those values. And believe it or not, many of the prisoners and people from disadvantaged areas look up to people who have values. They don't really respect people who, are chancellors themselves, or who are talking down to them or whatever. So it's a very challenging undertaking, but it must be done, and that's why there's some amazing youth workers and sports coaches and different people, teachers working in those areas, and they're doing amazing work. Never recognized, never in the limelight, but behind the scenes, they're doing amazing work.
Yeah. It's a big topic, John. I mean, to Chris's point, private schools, South County Dublin, rugby schools in Limerick, or just those that live in that type of bucket, if you will, and then those in working class areas. Has the policies of previous governments, and Ireland's still a relatively young country, right? So, very Catholic Church dominated, not a lot of opportunities for employment, and then we went into the 90s and the noughties, and we've seen working class areas maybe get, as you said, lagging behind in the same basic principles of opportunities for people in other different groups.
But
But
it is very important, Michael, to say that these areas are still there. But equally, it would be very important to also record tonight that many working class areas have made amazing progress over the last
amazing.
30, 40 years. And most of their children nowadays go to third level, and they have moved away miles from where their parents were at, even, and certainly their grandparents. So it is very important to recognize that many people in working class areas have made tremendous progress, but these are small pockets. Like there was 5 small pockets in Dublin, not postal districts at all, but 6 very small little pockets in Dublin in my time in Mountjoy. And those 6 little areas supplied 75% of all Dublin-born prisoners. And those 6 pockets are still there, and they haven't changed dramatically over the last 20 years. And until they are changed and the whole environment in those areas is changed, I'm afraid we'll still continue to be grooming children in those areas to be nothing other than criminals.
Listen, before I go, I see Keane and John, but one second, everyone. I just want to read out some of the comments from David. Hi, John. Always great insights. Remember reading your book about the work you initiated in the area of drama and creativity. I wonder, has that been seen progression or regression? Catherine says, remember going to a great night in Mountjoy, attending a production of West Side Story, thanks to your courage and vision. Dan, who couldn't get his audio to work, but has kindly written out his comment. Been learning a lot about the prison system lately. I was in Mountjoy and Limerick Prison over the last few months, and last week I was at a conference in Maynooth about extending opportunities for third level progression to people with convictions. And Friday at a conference on restorative practice. And wanted to ask John about the role of restorative practice and a story exchange. And the drama piece there, and then sort of educational restorative, and then I'll come to Keane, John, and our guests. Thank you all. If you
Well,
wouldn't mind
quickly,
answering that, John.
I mean, the drama projects in Mountjoy became, nationally famous for about 20 years. They had massive influence on both the prison population and the general public, because part of the whole official purpose and objective of the drama was to bring in people from the outside to let them see for themselves what a prison is like and what prisoners are like, but to see prisoners in a more positive light rather than the stereo negative image that most people have of prison. By the way, earned by prisoners in terms of their behavior. I wouldn't for a moment say that the public perception is wrong, but it is obsessed with the negative side, and we don't see the positive. And the drama was an opportunity to do that, and it's had tremendous benefits in a whole variety of ways. They're no longer in existence, and that's just part of the regression, I suppose, from where I would be coming from. In terms of restorative justice, there's a tremendous potential in restorative justice, provided it is being brought in on that basis. But I'm afraid that up to now, the little projects that we've had, and we had one in Tala a few years ago, and we had one in Nina and Tipperary, but it was very, very selective in relation to those who had allowed to participate. And the whole, for those who don't understand it, maybe the whole idea of restorative justice is to bring the victim and the perpetrator or the offender, or whatever title you want to label that person with, the person who has committed the crime, to try to bring the two sides together in relation to restoring the victim, restoring the individual who committed the crime, and restoring the community that was often damaged as a result of the crime. And in some countries, especially in New Zealand and places like that, and in some of the African countries, that works very well, because the communities are very mixed, and usually the crime happens in a community where the perpetrator and the victim lives. The problem in Ireland is that quite often the victim lives in a different type of area than the offender lives, and the room for restoring the community and the individual, the victim, is very, very limited. And but the principle of restoring, of bringing the perpetrator, face to face with his or her victim, is a powerful psychology. And I've seen it myself, and I was present in a few occasions when that happened, and I can assure people that it has a massive impact on the individual prisoner, meeting the victim in that sense and saying, look what you did to me. And most times the prisoner, for the first time ever, said, this is the first time I've ever thought even about a victim. So you have a long ways to go, but when you bring the victim alive, like, and say, look, this is the person who you have terrified. This is the person who can't leave their home now because they're terrified. It has the potential to make a huge impact on a young guy, especially because they are mainly young men that commit such crimes. So I'm a great supporter and believer that restorative justice has a place to play, but it has to be structured in a way that is meaningful.
Thanks a million, John. I will go to Keen, and then I see Guess. I'm going to name for Guess. We'll get there. Keen Harley, hello, good evening. Please raise your audio.
Hi, I'm hoping you can hear me. John, it's great to hear you so passionate and engaged still. And for me and for many Irish people, I would certainly see you as a trailblazer. Maybe you feel that you were just part of a movement at a time, but definitely from an Irish perspective, very proud of what you did. My question really is around the Humanist Association of Ireland. I'm trained in chaplaincy, and we have been working on putting together a group who would provide chaplaincy services in prisons and hospitals and so on. My question really is do you see it as having a limited impact within the likes of Mountjoy? And I presume most prisoners would be raised Catholic, but possibly not practicing. I'm just curious as to your view of chaplaincy and humanist chaplaincy within the prison service.
Yeah, the first thing to say is that when in my time, chaplains were by far probably the most influential profession in the prison. I have no hesitation in saying they were, and now over the years, and especially in the last 7 or 8, 10 years, the chaplaincy, I suppose, team, or the people who made up the chaplaincy team in the old days, were religious and mainly Catholics, but not exclusively. There was chaplains from all the different denominations in Mountjoy, but in terms of the main group of people were Catholic chaplains, priests, and then originally priests only, and then and I was involved in this, in developing chaplaincy teams, because the one person in the prison was limited. But then we developed chaplaincy teams, and many sisters, Catholic again, came on board, but they never allowed religion to have anything really got to do with what they did. Like, they were open to talking naturally to everybody. They were very influential. The prisoners had the highest respect for them, and they had a tremendous positive impact on prisons. Because they weren't, the main thing I was supposed to emphasize is they were seen to be separate to the establishment. They weren't seen to be part of the establishment. And that's part of one of the problems today with chaplaincy, is that most chaplains today are recruited in as lay people. They're recruited by the Irish Prison Service. They serve the Irish Prison Service, and they provide chaplaincy services in prison, which is not the same as what it used to be, in the sense of the independent voice of the chaplain. Now, in relation to the humanist group, Prime Chaplains, I have no hesitation in saying that if you could get it off the ground, and if you could go into the prisons, you would have an immediate impact and interest, and you know, a lot of prisoners would avail of that non-judgmental listening type of service that what chaplains really do. They really provide a listening hearing. That's mainly what they do. And advocacy, I suppose, advocating on behalf of prisoners afterwards, and saying these are the issues that we believe need to be highlighted. And chaplains used to give the voiceless prisoner a voice in terms of raising issues that often weren't popular, by the way, with the establishment. And so if you're successful in getting a little group together and to get into a prison like Mountjoy, I have no hesitation at all in saying that a team of people that would go in there to provide, as I said, a listening service, to be there, to befriend. One of the things that prisoners really, they don't get much opportunity to do is to be heard, because they come from homes often that don't listen a lot, where there's a lot of shouting and noise and aggression. Their communities don't listen. And often when they're in prison, nobody listens in prison either. And that's what chaplains do. Non-judgmental. They don't care what they're in for. They're just there to listen. And I had a chaplain, I worked with a chaplain who was in the women's prison for 8 years, a male, a priest. And he used to stand there most times. And when he was leaving after 8 years, we had a little celebration, a little presentation to him. And every single woman, over 70 of them in the women's prison, gave him a present of some description from their own heart, because they said, you are always here, you never interfered, but you are always there when we needed you. And that's really what chaplaincy is about, is to be there when you're needed, to hear, to listen, and to advocate.
Yeah, thank you for that. He sounds like the exact type of person that we need. Thank you for that. That sounds very heartening. Thank you.
Thank you for your question, Keenan. Something for us all to have a think about. We're always looking at these avenues to explore. I will ask guests to say hi and your name, please, because we like to get everyone's name. Thank you, Keenan, again for your question.
Hi, I hope you can hear me okay. Sorry that I'm appearing as guest. My name is Anya Mingawang. I'm Irish, but I'm actually based in Oslo in Norway. So it's a real pleasure to be able to join you this evening. Thank you so much, John.
I didn't catch your first name, beg your
pardon?
Anya, sorry.
Yeah. Sorry, I can't figure out how to change it on the iPad. Anyway, thank you very much for such an interesting talk. And I was really heartened to hear how much value you place on the arts and creativity and sports in prison settings. I'm really, it's really great to hear how much you value that in the prison system. And one of the comments as well was about going to a performance of West Side Story in Mountjoy a couple of years ago. I wanted to just share some knowledge that I have about an amazing choir project that's in Mountjoy at the moment, called the In-House Harmony Choir. And they have been running now for almost 6 years, and it's an inside-outside choir. So it's that exact thing that you mentioned, John, of like the theatre project of bringing in people from the outside. So it's a workplace choir that are based in Solis in Dublin. You may already know about it, I'm sure. And they run in the progression unit with men who are serving sentences there. But it's been very, very upsetting, because I've been working with this choir just over the last year or so, and because of the overcrowding and because of the changes with the prison system now, the choir is actually temporarily suspended, because there's just they've changed the around a lot of people who are in the progression unit, and so there's just issues around sustainability with those kinds of initiatives. So my question was really about, with the prison service being in the state that it's in, it's over 5,000 people. It's at the worst kind of overcrowding in the history of the Irish Republic. What would your advice? What would your experience? What would your wisdom tell us about how to manage with these initiatives that take so long to build, that take so long to form, these really humanistic projects that are about hearing people, like you just said, about being heard and giving voice to people. But then if they can just be shut down overnight because of overcrowding, because of safety issues, or whatever excuses are being used.
Yeah, I mean, I can empathize and identify with everything you've said, and it was part of the ongoing frustration that I had experienced myself over the years of trying to sustain stuff. It's amazing. Like if you think, when you can stand back from it a bit and sort of observe. Often the initial stages are fine. You like the starting up of the choir and building it up and getting in and doing it, and everyone is sort of saying this is brilliant and this is going well. And then for for whatever reason, then the blockages start coming in, the opposition, and it's overcrowding, or it's staff rostering, or it's security, or it's something else. And you just get frustrated, and what happens is it just disappears then. And over the years, like some of the most progressive things that were done in Mountjoy and in the Doka Centre, which is the women's prison, have all been dismantled and gone. And you're sort of saying, my God, like you go a certain bit and then you go back again. And, that's what I was saying about change and how frustrating it is. The only thing I would be saying to you is, whoever is driving it must keep at it, like, and don't take no for an answer, and just challenge people. If from the Irish Prison Service, the commitment sometimes of these, the Irish Prison Service headquarters would be cosmetic, that they'd like to be seen to be there when there's something, going on, or when there's something happening, but they're not prepared to give the support when it really matters down on the ground. Same with prison governors. Some of them, they just don't agree with any of this sort of stuff, and they're hardliners, and they believe that they lock them up and that's it, and there should be no softness at all. They see softness as a weakness, and of course I saw softness as a strength. And I'm sure you are in the same. The choir it might come across as soft, but it means that it's a discipline. People have to be committed to it. You have standards, you have values, and they learn. And then outsiders coming in, they set standards as well, and the prisoners have to raise themselves to get up to that standard. So it's a very nice, respectful way of introducing values and standards and entertainment, and then talent, because what you're saying is, listen, you're a lovely singer, you're a lovely artist, or whatever to be, and you can move on from the choir in Mountjoy to doing something on the outside or whatever. So you can build it up, and you build up confidence, and it eliminates boredom as well, which is another big part of prison. People are bored stiff. So and the talent bit, as you mentioned, that's what I discovered, that there was an amazing amount of talent in prison, and the reality was that they were never exposed, never got the opportunity to either discover the talent, not to mention to grow it. And that's what the likes of the choir can do. It discovers and allows fellas to discover their talent, and then it gives them the opportunity to benefit from that. And of course, then you can say to them, well, that's only one element to your ability. You have abilities on other fronts as well, if you just go off and look for them. And so, I would just say to the choir, you have to go back, start again, keep at it, don't take no for an answer. Every chance you get, you highlight the value of it. And I'm an old optimist. I'd say eventually you'll win out, but you will be frustrated to death. And a lot of people would tell me that they go to the gate to go in and they're held up for a half an hour or 30 minutes, 40 minutes. Then they get in, they're told you have 20 minutes or 30 minutes. And, that's all part of just making it more difficult. And you'd be surprised how many people, set out to do that. And then behind the scenes, you have lots of staff in prisons who are the very opposite. They love to get involved. They love to support. They love to help people. And they're often shoved away from it because, it only takes one bad apple to give, a whole barrel of apples a bad smell. And that's the reality with prison as well. But my belief is that anything that's good and music and the arts and all those things are definitely positive interventions in prisons, and you're on a winner, and the only thing is to convince people who have authority and the power to be supportive rather than to be destructive. But it's amazing how authorities sometimes are more destructive and obstructive than they are constructive.
John, I think, Anya, thank you. I kind of sort of something that I was thinking about before this, and maybe as I'm listening, um, we're very much looking at Ireland under this microscope this evening. If you're looking at your career and the prison system in Ireland, and Ireland as a country, where are other countries at that you see as, you know what, if we could have done things like they did them in a Norway or a New Zealand or is there anywhere else that you said, golly, if we'd only gone that route or that way with our country, we mightn't have had the type of prison system that we inherited from, our neighbours nearby. And like, is there anything that you think, if only we could have gone the Norway way or the Swedish way, and maybe a sense of how it's done
Well,
in
I
other
know.
countries?
Yeah, I was in Norway and I was in Denmark and I was in different countries, and I suppose what towards and I'm 14 years gone now, and I have to make sure that people understand that. So my stuff in terms of practical experience is gone. It's 14 years old, but I still read about it and I still observe. My view, Michael, is that on my experience is that most countries, including the Nordic countries, which are very progressive in terms relative to Ireland, but they too are struggling to hold that because the overwhelming wish is the more negative punishment driven approach that countries that are progressive find it very difficult to hold on to what they have. I would have said myself, though, based on my experience, that so some of like the women's prison, the Dorcas Centre, when it for the first 10 years when it was built and developed, it was as good and better than 99% of stuff around Europe, in my view. It had and the Irish prison system, in the old days even, it had an element of humanity that was often missing in lots of other prison systems. But I'm afraid, over the last 10 years in particular, a lot of that humanity, it seems to be disappearing. And overcrowding is certainly a contributory factor to that. But the attitude of staff coming in as well, and the governors of prisons as well, what they stand for and what they believe in. And if they are, a fairly rigid, autocratic type of people that believe in a fairly rigid regime, I'm afraid a lot of staff will follow that. So you really are dependent upon local leaders, like governors, to be an advocate for change. The great thing about Ireland is that if we wanted to, we could easily be the leaders in Europe in relation to prisons, because we have a very small prison population. We have 5 million people, and out of that, or 5 million people, and we have 5,000 prisoners, and 1,000 of them are people remanded in custody awaiting trial. So really, we only have 4,000 people in total. Couldn't we really be showing other countries this is how to do it? And instead of that, we're just replicating the more negative elements of every other country in Europe, including across the water. And, 30 years ago, Michael Howard in England was saying prisons work. And now you have the present government trying to empty prisons because they can't cope. Prisons don't work. They're a short-term intervention, but they don't change society, and they don't. Punishment is a negative experience and a destructive, necessary in some cases, but it's not a solution. And we need to be looking at other elements of the process rather than concentrating almost exclusively on the containment punishment side and balancing it more with the more constructive stuff.
Yeah, some big macro thoughts there. I did see there was a gentleman had his hand up. I'm not sure if he's still here. John Garrity, I do see you there,
Yes.
and I'm always conscious trying to give everyone, and we have gone over time, so I'll give John the chance for his comment, please, and then I'll circle back to summarize. Thank you, John.
Thank you. John Garrity. I'm just living south of Greystones in County Wicklow. John, it's been very, very interesting listening to your thoughts this evening. And what I'd like to ask you is, we were talking about prison and deprived areas. How do you feel about how we're treating immigrants coming into the country, where we're putting them in effective prisons, tented accommodation, the size of small villages, where water is pouring into the tents, where it's cold, and where they must be so bored, like you mentioned just a few moments ago. Have you any insights that you could offer into that as a form of treatment of something that's maybe a bit inhumane, and that I can't see where we might have any plans of how to cope with this in the future. Would you be able to share anything with us on that, John, please?
Yeah, I mean, first thing I say is that there's no question, but it's inhumane. It's appalling, and we're treating people with horrendous disrespect. So that's the first thing. Now, the second thing is to balance that off and say, I suppose we did inherit, again, almost unpredictable situation for a while, where there was thousands of people coming. And I suppose we have to acknowledge that it's very almost impossible to provide adequate accommodation overnight for ongoing demands after week after week after week. But the one thing it doesn't excuse is the absence, as you said, of plans and strategies for the future, because we need to have plans now. That putting people on tents and throwing people out into the middle of the country with no facilities, alienating people, forcing them into communities, on communities, all that sort of stuff is a recipe for a disaster. And we've got to start, I suppose, planning to how we're going to provide the type of quality accommodation that we should be providing, and supporting communities to provide. My view is a lot of communities will be very happy to take a number of people, but what really pisses them off is people come in hundreds and they're not able to cope. They don't have the medical services, or they don't have all the different capacity. And the other thing is that it takes time to integrate a new culture into a small community. And then in the urban areas, in the big urban areas, we're inclined to put more and more of them into the most deprived areas, and exacerbating the situation in those areas where there's an awful lot of anti feelings, and a lot of the people in these areas can easily be manipulated then into becoming almost racist, because they're being exploited, because they're already angry because they feel cut off. And now on top of everything else, these foreign, as they see it, foreign nationals are being put in, and they're giving higher status than they're getting, and all that sort of stuff, with supports that they are getting that the locals are not getting. So we need to sit down and it's funny, we're in the middle of a general election and very little is being said about it. It's not the big issue that it should be. Because it is a big issue and it needs to be dealt, and there needs to be a plan and a strategy to deal with it. And we can't go on alienating people, and we can't go on, as you said, putting people into tents. That's just not on. And young children, temporary accommodation for over 5,000 people at the moment, or 5,000 children. That itself is a scandal. Because if a child hasn't a fundamental stability of a home, well, I'm absolutely certain that is almost inevitable that they will end up in difficulty and become socially disconnected, and become a real burden on the state in terms of crime and addiction and all the other things. So we've got to stop. We have surplus all over the place, and we're certainly looking around. What can we do? These are where we have 5,000 children in temporary accommodation. We shouldn't have any surpluses.
Thank you for that.
Thank you, John. Thank you.
So I said we're a little bit over time, but it's been a very interesting and thought-provoking evening. I've really enjoyed all of the comments. I saw John Devan just asked about, have you any plans for writing another book, John? Anything in the pipeline?
No, no plans at the moment, no. You're too old, tell him.
Never too old. So listen, what we always like to do is say thank you to everybody who's attended, and everybody's input and comments. It's always appreciated, and makes my life easier when there's a little bit of engagement. We always get that. And for those who spoke and who commented, thank you, Gur Mahagut. John, what we like to do at this point is give the final word to our speaker. And so in this case, that's yourself. And maybe, like, yeah, just your thoughts of, where we're at, and what you see as the future, and along everything you've been involved in. And it's very clear. I mean, I think listening to governance and culture, you brought such positivity in your work, and the legacy must be there. Although you may say that it's maybe some way regress, I'm quite certain If you scratch under the surface, it's probably not that at all. I'm sure there's plenty of great work still being done, even with the limitations. Irish people are very resourceful, and we all are typically as humans resourceful when it comes to it. So, final word, John.
Yeah,
Over to you.
the final word is, I suppose, the philosophy of the Human Association itself is I can totally compatible with what I have been talking about. It's totally supportive of it. It's fundamental about respecting people, and I suppose I'd be saying to all the people that have joined tonight, you can. It's always the simple things. I mentioned about kindness. Be kind to other people. Be nice to other people. And if you can help people, help them. And if you can't, do nothing. Don't do anything destructive or negative or whatever. And you'd be amazed sometimes the small things of what I've discovered in my life is some of the things that I done nice things that I did unconsciously were often the things that prisoners in my case, and I'd be saying to the people that are on tonight, in your case, to the people that you have contact with, often the unconscious nice things you do to people stay with them for the rest of their lives. And that's a powerful sort of an endorsement for doing nice things, to be kind to people, but above all, to respect people.
Great way to finish this off. I think we all try to abide by that mindset as best we can. Everybody has their tough days, and I coach people in swimming and kids, and I always try and say to them, when you come to the class, smile, because if you can smile at the start, then you might be able to get through what lies ahead. And it's amazing what a little bit of just a moment to try to gather your thoughts and maybe banish some of the badness that happened over the course of a day.
It's the most powerful way to break social barriers. The smile.
Exactly. So on that note, I will say thank you again, John. Gur Maithagul, everybody, and have a wonderful evening. And we will get the video up on our website, our YouTube channel. And then if people do want to inquire about contacting John, we can support that as well as needed. So thank you so much, and good night.
Thanks a million.